The day I inherited my grandfather's ranch, I discovered an entire neighborhood sitting on my land, and somehow, I was the last person to know. I'm not talking about a fence a few feet over the property line or some neighbor who planted a shed where it didn't belong. I'm talking about 50 houses, paved streets, streetlights, mailboxes, landscaped entrances, the whole picture-perfect suburban dream. And every bit of it was sitting on land that legally belonged to me. When my grandfather, Walter Hayes, passed away, I wasn't exactly eager to become a ranch owner. Don't get me wrong, I loved the place. I practically grew up there. Summers were spent fixing fences, chasing cattle, and listening to Grandpa tell stories on the porch while pretending he wasn't teaching me life lessons. But ranching was his world, not mine. I had a construction consulting job in Colorado, a mortgage, and a life that felt pretty settled. The ranch was something I visited, not something I expected to own. Still, when the attorney called and told me Grandpa had left everything to me, I felt a responsibility I couldn't ignore. So a few weeks after the funeral, I drove down to Cedar Ridge County to start sorting through the paperwork. I expected tax documents, maintenance issues, maybe some arguments with neighboring landowners. What I didn't expect was the feeling that I had somehow taken a wrong turn and ended up in the middle of a suburban development. The ranch stretched across thousands of acres, and on my third day there, I decided to drive the perimeter. Grandpa always said you couldn't understand land from a map. You had to walk it, drive it, feel it. About an hour into that drive, I noticed something strange. The dirt trail I remembered from childhood was gone. In its place was fresh black asphalt. At first I thought the county had expanded a nearby road. Then I saw the streetlights. Then the sidewalks. Then the decorative stone entrance sign. Willow Brook Meadows. I actually laughed out loud. I remember sitting there behind the steering wheel thinking, well, that's new. I pulled forward and just stared. Rows of houses stretched across what I knew had once been open grazing land. Kids rode bicycles. Sprinklers sprayed green lawns. SUVs sat in driveways. It looked like one of those developments you'd see advertised with slogans about peaceful family living and luxury country charm. The weird part wasn't that the neighborhood existed. The weird part was where it existed. My first assumption was simple. Grandpa must have sold this section years ago. It made perfect sense. He'd gotten older. Maybe he needed money. Maybe he'd decided he didn't need that acreage anymore. So I drove back to the ranch house and started digging through records. The more I searched, the less sense anything made. There was no sale agreement, no deed transfer, no documentation showing ownership had changed hands. By that evening, I was convinced I was missing something. The next morning, I called the county records office. The woman who answered sounded bored at first, but after looking through the files, she became noticeably less confident. That's strange, she said. According to what I'm seeing, those parcels are still registered under Hayes Family Ranch Holdings. I sat there in silence. Are you sure? I asked. She checked again. Same answer. Now, if you've ever dealt with county records, you know mistakes happen. Old maps, data entry errors, missing filings. I figured this was one of those situations. So instead of getting excited, I hired one of the most respected surveyors in the region. His name was Rick Townsend, a guy who looked like he'd spent 40 years arguing with property lines and winning. 3 weeks later, Rick showed up at the ranch carrying a thick folder. He didn't even sit down. He dropped the folder onto my kitchen table and said, well, you're going to want to see this. We spread out maps across the table. Survey markers, historical plats, satellite images, legal descriptions. Then Rick pointed at the development. Every single structure is inside your property boundary. I stared at him. Every one. He nodded. Every house. Every road. Every utility easement. All of it. I felt my stomach drop. Not because I was excited. Honestly, I was terrified. Because suddenly this wasn't a paperwork issue anymore. This was a legal disaster involving dozens of families. I remember walking out onto the porch that night and sitting in Grandpa's old chair. The sun was setting over the fields, and for the first time since inheriting the ranch, I felt completely overwhelmed. Somewhere between Grandpa's ownership and my inheritance, something had gone horribly wrong. And whatever it was, 50 homeowners had no idea they were standing in the middle of it. What I didn't know yet was that the deeper we dug, the worse the story would become, because the neighborhood wasn't built by mistake. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. The next 2 months felt less like managing an inheritance and more like uncovering a crime scene that had been buried under fresh concrete. After Rick finished the survey, I hired a real estate attorney named Daniel Mercer, a guy with the calm personality of a surgeon and the patience of someone who had spent decades cleaning up other people's disasters. The first thing Daniel said after reviewing the documents was something I'll never forget. He leaned back in his chair and said, "This neighborhood shouldn't exist. That's not what you want to hear when 50 families are living comfortably less than 2 miles from your ranch house." We started pulling every record we could find. Bankruptcy filings, development permits, county commission meeting minutes, old environmental studies, construction approvals. It was like assembling a giant puzzle where half the pieces had been hidden on purpose. Eventually, the picture came together. About 8 years earlier, a developer named Preston Development Group had announced plans for a luxury subdivision called Willowbrook Meadows. The company acquired several parcels around the county and planned to build over 100 homes. On paper, they also intended to acquire a section of the Hayes Ranch. Intended being the key word. They negotiated. They drafted agreements. They even began preliminary planning. But for reasons nobody could fully explain, the actual transfer of ownership was never completed. Then the company ran into financial trouble. Loans collapsed. Contractors stopped getting paid. Halfway through construction, Preston Development filed for bankruptcy. That's where things should have stopped. But somehow they didn't. New investors came in. Construction resumed. Permits kept getting renewed. Houses got sold. Families moved in. Meanwhile, the original ownership issue remained unresolved. The land beneath the development never legally left my grandfather's name. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Not because I wanted to throw people out of their homes. I didn't. Most of those homeowners were innocent. They bought houses, signed mortgages, raised kids, planted gardens. They trusted the system. The problem was that everyone involved seemed to assume somebody else had checked the paperwork. Nobody actually had. Daniel finally looked at me one afternoon and said, "You need to contact the HOA." So I did. A week later, I attended one of their board meetings. I'll be honest, I went in expecting reasonable people. Maybe some confusion. Maybe some concern. What I found instead was pure arrogance. The meeting was held in a clubhouse near the entrance of the subdivision. The board sat behind a long table while residents filled rows of folding chairs. I introduced myself and explained the situation as politely as possible. At first there was silence. Then people started laughing. Actual laughter. The HOA president, a retired corporate executive named Martin Keller, smiled like I had just told a joke. "You're saying this entire neighborhood belongs to you?" he asked. "No," I replied. "I'm saying the land belongs to me." More laughter. Martin leaned forward. "Young man, this community has been here for years. You can't just walk in and claim ownership because of some paperwork technicality." I remember feeling my jaw tighten. Paperwork technicality. Those words stayed with me. Property ownership isn't a technicality. It's literally the foundation of ownership. But I kept my cool. "The survey is clear," I said. "The county records are clear. The deed is clear." Martin shrugged. "Then sue us." The room erupted with chuckles. Looking back, that was probably the biggest mistake they made. If they had approached the situation with humility, everything might have ended differently. Instead, they treated me like an inconvenience. A kid who inherited a ranch and didn't know what he was talking about. So I stopped trying to convince them. Daniel and I moved forward legally. Certified letters went out to every homeowner and every board member. The letters weren't eviction notices. They weren't threats. They simply informed residents of an unresolved land ownership dispute and pending legal action. That's when the panic started. My phone began ringing nonstop. Some homeowners were furious. Others were scared. A few were surprisingly understanding. One woman named Sarah showed up at the ranch with a folder full of documents and tears in her eyes. She and her husband had spent their life savings on their home. "Please tell me we're not losing everything," she said. That conversation hit me hard. I assured her that wasn't my goal. I wasn't trying to destroy families. I wanted a legal solution. But the HOA board continued acting like the problem didn't exist. They hired attorneys, filed responses, made public statements claiming they possessed implied access rights and historical usage protections. They talked tough in newsletters and community meetings. Then Daniel filed suit in county court. Once that happened, things got very real very quickly. Depositions started. Records were subpoenaed. Former developers were questioned. County officials testified, and every week new evidence surfaced showing that the ownership issue had been ignored repeatedly for years. One former project manager testified that concerns had been raised during construction but were dismissed because resolving them would have delayed sales. Another witness revealed internal communications discussing title discrepancies. Every revelation made the board look worse. Then came the hearing that changed everything. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it felt tense enough to hold a thunderstorm. The judge reviewed months of evidence. Surveys, deeds, historical ownership records, bankruptcy filings. By that point, the facts were nearly impossible to dispute. At the end of the hearing, the judge issued a temporary order recognizing my ownership interest pending final resolution. That order included something everyone had overlooked. The primary access road leading into Willow Brook Meadows crossed land that belonged to me. I remember walking out of the courthouse with Daniel. We stood on the steps while reporters gathered nearby. Daniel looked at me and asked, "So what do you want to do now?" I looked toward the horizon and thought about Martin Keller laughing at me during that first meeting. Then I thought about Sarah and the other homeowners who deserved a solution. Finally, I said, "I want them to negotiate." Daniel nodded. "And if they won't?" I looked back at the courthouse. "Then we'll remind them why property rights matter." 2 weeks later, we submitted plans for a controlled access gate on the private road. Everything was done legally. Permits, notices, engineering reviews, sheriff's oversight. Nothing hidden, nothing rushed. The HOA board called it intimidation. Their attorneys called it excessive. The judge disagreed. On the morning construction began, residents gathered near the entrance watching crews install steel posts and electronic barriers. Martin arrived red-faced and furious. He marched across the pavement toward me. "You can't do this," he snapped. I almost laughed at the irony. Months earlier, he'd told me to sue. Now he was upset that the legal process had consequences. "Actually," I replied calmly, "the court says I can." For a few seconds, he just stared at me. Then he turned and walked away. Within days, the pressure became unbearable for the HOA. Delivery companies started asking questions. Mortgage lenders raised concerns. Contractors delayed projects. Insurance companies requested clarification regarding access rights. Home sales stalled. Refinancing applications froze. Suddenly, a problem they had spent months dismissing became impossible to ignore. Homeowners started demanding answers. Community meetings became shouting matches. Residents who had trusted the board began realizing they had never been told the full story. One particularly heated meeting ended with multiple board members being escorted out by deputies after arguments nearly turned physical. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, the balance of power shifted. Late one evening, my phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw Martin Keller's name. The same man who had laughed at me months earlier sounded very different now. His voice was quiet, careful, measured. "Maybe it's time we discuss a settlement," he said. I leaned back in my chair and looked out across the ranch fields glowing under the setting sun. After everything that had happened, after the lawsuits, the insults, the delays, and the arrogance, they finally wanted to talk. What they didn't realize was that by waiting so long, the price of that conversation had become far more expensive than they ever imagined. By the time Martin Keller called asking for a settlement, the situation had completely flipped. Months earlier, they had treated me like some confused grandson who wandered into a legal technicality. Now they were dealing with angry homeowners, frozen transactions, nervous lenders, and a growing realization that the problem wasn't going away. The negotiations started the following week. We met inside a conference room at a law office downtown. There were attorneys, financial consultants, title experts, board members, and more stacks of paperwork than I thought could fit on a single table. The HOA's first proposal almost made me laugh. They wanted to purchase the disputed land based on values from nearly a decade earlier, back when the development was first planned. Daniel looked at the offer, slid it back across the table, and simply said, "No." The room went quiet. One board member argued that the homeowners shouldn't be punished for mistakes made by developers years ago. Honestly, I agreed with that part. The homeowners weren't the villains in this story. But that didn't change reality. The land had value. The damages were real. The legal costs were real. And the reason those costs existed was because people in positions of authority had ignored warning signs for years. So we made our position clear. Current market value. Full compensation for damages. reimbursement of legal expenses, properly recorded easements, permanent resolution, nothing less. The negotiations dragged on for weeks. Some days it felt like progress was happening. Other days it felt like everyone was speaking different languages. Meanwhile, pressure inside Willowbrook Meadows kept building. Homeowners began demanding resignations. Internal emails surfaced. Questions nobody wanted to answer suddenly became impossible to avoid. The same board that once laughed at me was now fighting to keep residents from voting them out. Then came the breakthrough. One evening, after nearly 8 hours of negotiations, the HOA's legal team finally accepted the framework of our proposal. Nobody celebrated. Nobody shook hands dramatically. Everyone in that room looked exhausted. It wasn't victory that people felt. It was relief. Relief that the uncertainty was finally ending. Over the next several weeks, financing packages were assembled, agreements were finalized, and signatures were collected. The final number ended up costing the HOA and associated parties several $1,000,000 more than they would have paid had they resolved the issue years earlier. That part wasn't my fault. Delay has a price. Arrogance has a price. Ignoring reality has a price. Eventually the money was transferred. Easements were recorded. Property lines were legally adjusted. The subdivision remained standing. The homeowners kept their houses. And the ranch received compensation that reflected what had actually happened. About 6 months later, I drove through Willowbrook Meadows one last time. The gate was gone. The legal battle was over. Kids were playing basketball in driveways. People were walking dogs. Life had returned to normal. As I passed the clubhouse, I noticed something that made me smile. The HOA board listed on the community bulletin board was completely different. Every single member had been replaced. Accountability had arrived, even if it came later than it should have. Before leaving, I stopped at a small neighborhood park. A woman approached me carrying a cup of coffee. It was Sarah, the homeowner who had visited the ranch months earlier, terrified she might lose everything. She smiled and said, "I never thought I'd say this, but thank you." I looked surprised. She laughed. "Not for the lawsuit," she said. "For forcing everyone to finally tell the truth." That stayed with me. Because the truth is, I never wanted to block a road. I never wanted a legal war. I never wanted families worrying about their homes. What I wanted was simple: recognition, responsibility, accountability. My grandfather spent his entire life respecting land ownership because he understood something many people forget. Property isn't just dirt. It's trust. It's agreements. It's promises written down so future generations don't have to guess. If those promises stop matching, everything else starts falling apart. Sometimes people ask whether I feel guilty about what happened. The honest answer is no. I feel bad for the homeowners. I feel bad for the stress and uncertainty they endured. But I don't feel guilty for defending something that legally belonged to my family. The people who should feel guilty are the ones who had every opportunity to verify the ownership records and chose not to. Looking back now, the strangest part of the entire story isn't that 50 houses ended up on my land. The strangest part is how many educated professionals simply assumed somebody else had done their job. Everyone trusted assumptions. Nobody checked the deed. And that single decision cost millions of dollars. So here's the question I've argued about with people ever since. If you discovered an entire neighborhood had been built on property you legally owned, would you have fought for your rights the way I did? Or would you have walked away to avoid disrupting other people's lives? Let me know in the comments, because even now, years later, people still can't agree on where justice ends and responsibility begins. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. I'd really like to hear what you would have done in my position.